That should be us now. Okay, so good afternoon everyone, and thanks for coming along to this virtual session on fire safety in Woodlands. My name's Sharon Smith and I'm the Member Support Officer for Community Woodlands Association. In today's session, we're delighted to be joined by two very experienced people who spend their time in fire prevention and fire management, as well as I'm sure many other things. We're joined by Deputy Assistant Chief Officer Bruce Farquharson from the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and is the Head of Training Wildfire Capability Lead Officer. And Bruce is also the Chair of the Scottish Wildlife Forum. I hope I got all of that right, Bruce.
Wildfire Forum, but it's close, Sharon.
Wildfire Forum. There you go. And we're also joined by Colin McClean, who joins us from the Cairngorms National Park Authority, where Colin is the Head of Land Management. In this session, we hope to enlighten you all in ways to prepare well for fire management, especially in times when we face regularly colder, drier springs, followed by dry, hot summers, when wildfires are ever increasing. It's important our community woodland groups prepare well in advance for the risk of fire and the actual actions required should a fire start. Both Bruce and Colin will hopefully provide you with the answers throughout this session, and you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. Quick outline for today. We're going to begin with Bruce, followed by Colin. Now, I have bullet points there as you can read on the screen, but I'm sure the content of both sessions will overlap and intertwine as both our presenters speak. So I've got questions and answers at the end, but Colin and Bruce, if you're happy to take questions as we go, that would be wonderful, as they might arise more timely. Before we begin, though, please indulge me slightly, as I'd like to talk a little bit about Community Woodlands Association. Okay, why is it not clicking? Here we go. There we go. So we're joined by a few non-members today, and I just wanted to explain to you exactly what the role of Community Woodlands Association is. And quite simply, it helps communities to connect to their woodlands. We've over 200 members, most of whom are community woodland groups, owning or managing woodlands in Scotland. One of the benefits of being a member of Community Woodlands Association is that we advocate in the political arena on behalf of our members. For example, we're currently responding to the deer control consultation. We provide support and advice to the communities who are looking to start up a community woodland group, or who already have a woodland and are looking for ongoing support. We listen to our members' needs and then support with training sessions, exchange visits, mentoring programmes, and we also have an annual conference. We also provide professional support. On the call today, we have Piers Voicey. He is one of the members of our team who is a professional forester, and he is able to provide paid advice and consultancy to any groups. And we also work in partnership with strategic partners across Scotland to make it easier for our communities to be actively involved in woodland management. So if you're not a member, you can scan this code just now to join. This link will take you to the page on our website, or I will put the link in the chat so that you are able to access it later. So let me just copy that link just now, and I'll put that in the chat for you now. Great. So without any further ado, Bruce, I'm going to pass over to you. Now, I should have actually said to you about you taking control of the slides. Would you like to do that yourself, or do you want me to do it for you?
No, that's fine, Sharon. I can do that myself. It's just the two buttons at the bottom of the screen, so I'll manage that.
It's actually not, Bruce. You need to go to the top and beside.
Take control. Okay, I'll do that. Take control.
You do that for me. That'd be great. Magic. Thanks very much. Thank you.
No problem. So thank you, Sharon, and thank you for the invite, everybody, to come along and talk to you this afternoon about wildfires and forest fires. So as has been said, I'll just jump forward. I'm the Deputy Assistant Chief Officer, with my day job being Head of Training. But I'm also the Wildfire Capability Lead for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and as a result, chair the Scottish Wildfire Forum. So I've been doing this now for nearly 10 years, and I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to speak to you around about three separate points really. A little bit about the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and our experience of woodland and forest fires, a little bit about a fire plan and what that might contain, and finally what happens when the fire service turn up at an incident. As Sharon said, I'm happy to take questions at the end, but equally if you have a question during my talk, please either put your hand up or put something in the chat bar, and I'll try and answer them as best I can. So, a little bit about the fire service and our experience, not just to do with forest and wildfires, but in general, because the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service is actually a very young organisation. We were created as a single entity in 2013, but before that, we were 8 legacy services around the country. There was Highlands and Islands, Grampian, Tayside, Fife, Central Region, Dumfries and Galloway, Lothian and Borders, and Strathclyde, and we all became one happy family in 2013 at exactly the same time as the police became one happy family. But we are, well, one of our constituent parts, Lothian and Borders, was the oldest fire service in the world. The first municipal fire service was created 200 years ago, this year actually, by a man called James Braidwood. So we've got a long legacy in Scotland. When we became the one service, we became the largest service in the UK and the 4th largest worldwide. So we are quite an influential service both in the UK, across Europe, and indeed at a world stage. And we've got a wealth of experience across all different fire types. But obviously today we're going to speak specifically about wildfires. So in relation to wildfire versus forest fire, and sometimes the phrases are used interchangeably, but actually in Scotland, forest fires are thankfully at the moment very, very rare. However, wildfires unfortunately are not quite so rare, and last year we attended at least one wildfire every day during the wildfire season, which is we're right in the middle of right now, or at the beginning of perhaps. So what's important to understand about the difference between the two is two key things really, the fuel types and fire behaviour. So I'll start first of all with the different fuel types. And you please know there are only 2 different types of fuel. Fine fuels, which the name kind of gives the game away. They are small diameter fuels, less than 6 millimetres, grass, small stems, pine needles, that sort of stuff. They tend to form that litter layer that lies along the ground, but also things like heather and grass also are classed as fine fuels. But so are pine needles. So you do find fine fuels in huge quantities in coniferous forests. And the coarser fuels, as the name would suggest, are those larger pieces of material, twigs, branches, tree trunks, that sort of material. And it's very important to differentiate between the two because of very different characteristics when exposed to fire. So when we get these different fuels involved in fire, fine fuel, it dries out very quickly. So not only does it react to fire, but it can give rise to fire because it doesn't take very much at all to produce large quantities of very dry fine fuels that is very, very easy to light. Now that can happen through either the traditional hot sunshine, and you see at the end of the summer a large amount of dry fine fuels as a result of our warmer days. And you think about the fires we had last year in London, that was at the end of a heat wave, and all the fine fuels been dried out. But at this time of year, it's extreme cold that dries the fine fuels out, takes the moisture right out of them, either via frost or easterly winds, and because they tend to be drier than southerly or westerly winds. So we've got an awful lot at this time of year, an awful lot of fine fuel that is very, very dry. Despite all the snow and rain that we get, it dries out very quickly. It ignites very, very easily. It burns very quickly, but it doesn't generate a tremendously challenging fire behaviour. So we don't get large flames and we don't get high intensity, but it is an easy to light thing. Think about the kindling in a fireplace. You know, the smaller stuff is what you light first. It burns quickly, it burns brightly, and it allows the coarser stuff to be set on fire. So our coarser fuels tends to be what we'll find in a forested area. It dries very slowly, and you know, if you think about freshly felled trees, you'll generally have them seasoning for a year at least, unless you are forced drying them. before you will put them into a fire, because they're just wet. They're wet through right to the core. They dry out very slowly. They don't ignite very readily, but when they do burn, they burn with a higher intensity and they will burn for longer. So that's the differentiation between the different fuel types. So I can hear you asking across the virtual airwaves there, so what? Why is that important? Well, fine fuels are what we get burning in Scotland. They really are what cause wildfires. They start easily, they burn quickly, low intensity, but if we get an interface where there's coarse fuels involved, then that's when we begin to see really challenging incidents with a larger response required over a longer period of time and more of an impact, and potentially far more dangerous. And fine fuels can be set alight in Scotland mainly by human interaction. Very, very rarely do we see anything other than that. In fact, in my 31 years in the fire service, I only know of one fire that's been caused by anything other than people, and that can be people through either act or omission, and generally accidental. But we did have one lightning strike a couple of years ago at Gary Bridge, or Roy Bridge, a lightning strike without any rain, and that caused a fire to begin there that lasted a few days. So I want to now just move on to specifically talk a little bit about how we can get forest fires, because that's the purpose of today's talk at the start of my session anyway. So if I put this slide on screen, you can see I've borrowed this picture from the Wildfire National Operational Guidance document that the Scottish Government has. And it just gives an idea about the different types of fuels, and it's the elevated and aerial fuels, the blue coloured ones, that are the ones that are of importance for forest fires. But that's not where fires happen. They will happen in the surface fuels, which is that fine fuel we've just mentioned, or occasionally the near surface fuels when shrubs are set alight first of all. What we all want to avoid at all costs is the ground fuels becoming involved, because then that's the peat, and that can burn for weeks, if not months, and cause a huge amount of carbon to be released in the atmosphere. And the method of extinguishing a peat fire is so invasive and devastating that it does almost as much damage as the fire would do itself. But we're just going to focus on the aerial fuels and elevated fuels at the moment. So, ladder fuels, the clue is in the name here. Why is this important? I've talked a little bit about the fine fuels, and that tends to be the litter layer, the heathers. But where we get heather turning into gorse, gorse turning into young trees, and young trees turning into adult trees, we've effectively got a ladder which the fire will climb up. And when we get ladder fuels, what we're trying to avoid is the fire getting into the upper aerial fuel levels. And the reason for that is that if a fire gets into the crown of a forest, or into the top levels of aerial fuels, fire service can't put it out using traditional methods. It becomes almost impossible, and it's certainly extremely dangerous. So we either have to use an aerial attack, or we have to just contain the fire and let it burn itself out. Either way, it's hugely expensive, hugely time-consuming, and extremely dangerous. So the reason I mention this is that fuel management is really important to both prevent and mitigate wildfires and forest fires. Where we have that fuel continuity from surface layers all the way up to aerial fuels, if we've not got a clear break in that vertical fuel arrangement, then we are going to see wildfires able to spread from the ground all the way up to the crown of a forest. So if we have a little look at the different scenarios where we can see under canopy fire spread, you can see here in both of those pictures, what one is a more natural woodland, one's a planted woodland. There is material underneath the canopy that can burn. On the right-hand picture, you've got leaves, and on the left-hand picture, you've got ferns and other small shrubs. But there's a gap between the flammable material further up the tree and the ground. So we've got a good example here of what I would call a managed landscape, where yes, there is material under the ground, and yes, it will go on fire, but the likelihood of it having a fire behaviour that will cause the canopy to become involved is extremely little. If I go back to the slide before, you can see here that we've got continuity of fuel all the way from the ground level up to the crown. So that under canopy fire spread, it will always happen. There'll always be something that will burn in under the canopy, but where we've got a gap in the vertical arrangement, it's going to prevent that fire from spreading to the crown. We've also got two different types of woodland. We've got that semi-natural and we've got planted. So the semi-natural tends to have a variegated species type. So we're not just looking at a monoculture. So think about the planted pine stands that we've got all around the country that is there simply for harvesting, essentially. The variegated species, the plants will react differently to fire than a single plant type will react. I put unmanaged with a question mark after it, and corresponding in the planted column I put managed with a question mark. Semi-natural can be managed and should be managed to make sure we've not got that continuity of fuel that will allow the ladder fuels to take place. But it tends to look very natural and unmanaged, so that's the secret. You know, a managed landscape that looks natural is what we're looking for. And I put managed in the planted bit because stands that are planted for harvesting tend to be highly managed, but often that management involves the removal of lower growth, and it's left as brash behind, which is a managed landscape, but an extremely challenging landscape, and certainly one in which fire will thrive, because that cut brash material becomes extremely dry and does in itself present a ladder fuel. It also has a really high fire intensity and extreme fire behaviour when it goes on fire. Sit back to semi-natural, less dense, and you can walk through it. It's pleasant. Think about bluebell woods and all these sorts of things. They are pleasant places to be, versus a stand of pine where you wouldn't want to go into it because it's pitch black. There's nothing underneath it except for pine cones, and you know, it tends to look almost dead underneath. The semi-natural woodlands, they do tend to, if they do get instance where they go on fire, the fire intensity isn't that high because the trees are quite far apart. They tend not to be coniferous, so they have less of a oil loading within their leaves, and they tend to be wetter, so they won't burn as intensely, and the fire will spread less quickly. Whereas if we do get fires that go into a planted stand, then we do see a really high in fire intensity because you've got a lot of material close together, and that presents extreme fire behaviour. So what does extreme fire behaviour look like? Torching and crowning, and you can see the two pictures there. They are extremely challenging instances to deal with. We do see this, and we have seen this in recent years. We had a fire in Aberdeenshire at Aberlour a few years ago, where we did see a canopy fire. Very, very rare, extremely difficult to deal with, as I said earlier on. Far too dangerous for me to commit firefighters into that environment because the fire is above them. And essentially we will either find a natural break, create a break, or do aerial bombardment. Helicopters are not the silver bullet for dealing with wildfires. They are a tool within the arsenal, but they're only as effective as a good ground attack. So you need to have that combined approach. So a lot of people seem to think that just get a helicopter in and that'll solve the problem. It really won't. It is a useful tool in some occasions, but it isn't the be all and end all. So that's just a little bit about experience of wildfires and forest fire, and a little bit about what can lead to a forest fire from a wildfire. But the key thing to take away from there is good fuel management, both under the canopy and around the plantation, can protect the trees from devastating fire, whether that be a wildfire which enters the wood from outside, or indeed something that is started under the canopy, usually deliberately, but not with malice. So think about people having a campfire under trees at night and just not extinguishing it properly. That's the sort of scenarios we're trying to protect from. So removing that ladder fuel, removing brash, and creating a break round about the forest will offer excellent protection from fire. So the second point I was asked to cover today is a little bit about fire plans, and I'll try not to steal Colin's thunder because I know he's going to talk about fire plans as well. But just a little bit about what a fire plan should do. So to me, there's 4 key things to have within a good fire plan. It's not all about the response once the fire has happened. It's about how we stop that from happening. So fire prevention, and as I've got on the screen there, good fuel management is absolutely key to that. But just as important is a really good level of information to the people that either work or visit the woodland for whatever reason that may be, whether it be recreational, whether it be for exercise, whether it be for their employment. We need to get good quality information to people about the risk from fire. And in Scotland, people tend to be quite informed. They don't seem to understand the risk at the certain times of year. So, for example, on the 1st of March this year, we launched the wildfire prevention campaign. And as happens every year, we got quite a lot of ridicule on social media about it still being cold and wet and snowy. So how could we possibly have a risk of fire? Because people align air temperature to fire because that's what they see in other parts of the world. But in Scotland, that's not what we experience. So good quality information about the risk of fire and how people can protect both themselves and the environment from their actions, essentially. And we need to have a tiered approach. So fire prevention needs to be tiered to those that work on that landscape. They need to have a higher level of information, a higher level of understanding compared to those that information the public gets. So it's about getting the right information to the right people. So a very simple message for the public, but perhaps a more in-depth piece of information for those that actually manage that landscape. We need to put in place some form of mitigation as well. Now, you'll be familiar with the beaters that are provided in some woodlands for people to use. That in itself is a form of mitigation, but it tends to be one that people will only use if a fire happens, and even then possibly not, and only if they are in good condition and fit for purpose. So there's a lot of ifs in there. But what we can do is identify what is at risk in this forest or in this landscape, and that can be infrastructure, that can be rare species, that can be items of value to the landowner, whether it be a stock that they're wanting to harvest. It might be an ancient monument that's within the land. There could be lots of things. It could be a value that's at risk. And we need to put some protection around about that in way of a fire break, in way of an enhanced patrol regime, perhaps, if the fire risk is high, but some form of effort put in to make sure that the values that we have within that landscape are protected if a fire happens. And that can, as I said, be fire breaks, but it can also be the provision of infrastructure such as paths and roadways or water supplies, so that if a fire does break out, then there's a ready supply of water with which to protect that value, and access is easy for firefighters to get in. The response part, which everybody thinks is the key part of a fire plan, but it is only one part of it. The response part I'll come on to cover in just a bit more depth in just a second or two, but it should include training for people that are going to respond, equipment and PPE that is suitable for those responders, and importantly, I think one of the most important things actually is the creation of a local fire group. And we've got a few examples in the country of fire groups that work really well. And it's really just a collection of people that come together in a geographical area with some structure about it. And again, I'll cover that in just a second. And the final part of a fire plan is the recovery. So everybody forgets about what happens after the fire. How do we get back to normality? But actually, recovery starts the very second a response starts. That's us trying to get back to normality by putting the fire out. But by having a good business continuity plan that is fit for purpose, that meets all the different needs for that landscape, that's a really important tool to have. By having that, you're actually preparing for a return to normality well before the fire happens. Now, what a business continuity plan contains will vary depending on the use of that forest and that land, but it's just a little bit of pre-thought about how, if a bad thing happened, how would we get back to either where we are right now or certainly on the path to where we are right now. So I would really encourage people to think long and hard about what a recovery plan looks like. So just a little bit more about the response plan and fire groups. So a response plan really should just have key bits of information about who will respond to a fire in the area, what phone numbers are required, where are the rendezvous points that can be used by the fire service, what roads could the fire service use. Bear in mind, we're turning up in 18-ton appliances, so are there any weak bridges that you'd really don't want us going over? Get a map that shows all that with colour-coded roads and tracks that can be used for different vehicles. Let us know what equipment you've got. Let us know what infrastructures are there that we need to prioritise when we're looking at our hierarchy of attack. We'll always prioritise life risk over anything else, but then we may want to focus on other things, and you are the people that know what you think should be prioritised, and you should really have that in a form that we can access very quickly. Have a communication plan about how you're going to get both the message out that a fire has happened, but also about how you might begin to muster a response. Know where your water supplies are. Identify hazards to us, and hazards can be lots of things. Overhead electrical lines, cliffs, wild animals that are enclosed, all sorts of things that may present a hazard to us. Wind farms in particular have a number of hazards that we need to be aware of, not the least of which is the material that's released from these masts if they do begin to go on fire. So it's just a plan that gives ideally a mapped overview of the site that's involved, a list of people who we may want to consider contacting or who could come along and support us at the incident, and where we can access water and roadways into the incident. Now, I mentioned a fire group. This is the next logical step for a fire plan, and it's where you speak to your neighbours and identify how you will all support each other through mutual aid, what the call-out procedures are, a communication plan, so an identification of a radio channel that is common to you all that you would use in the event of a fire, identify who would be a fire liaison officer, so somebody that will be that conduit of information. So if I turn up to a fire, I'll be looking for somebody that understands that area, can give me good quality information, and really they are performing that fire liaison role. So why not prepare people beforehand so they can have a bit of a starter, so that when the fire service turns up, they know what sort of things are going to be asked. You also need to think a little bit about administration and logistics and all the boring stuff behind the scenes, but it becomes increasingly important the longer a fire develops, about how we resupply and make sure that everybody that needs fed gets fed, that there are welfare facilities in place, all that sort of good stuff, and health and safety. Now, I will cover health and safety in the bit about what happens when the fire service turn up, but you need to make sure that if you have your own staff or volunteers who are going to support at an incident, that they understand what health and safety at a fire may look like. It may well be that you're there before we are. You identify there's a fire, you find the fire, so you have to prepare people for what they should and should not do. But the important thing is you shouldn't ever force or encourage somebody to do something that is beyond what is safe and within their own capabilities. And the interesting thing is that what I think is safe for me may not be what you think is safe for you. And a lot of things can come into account there. It can be experience, it can be ability, it can be training, or it can simply be your risk appetite. Some people just don't want to have anything to do with risky things, and that's absolutely fine. Other folk are a bit more gung-ho and just want to get into things that perhaps they shouldn't. But that's where the fire service can come in and provide that little bit of structure. So local fire groups are a really, really important thing to consider, and there's a really good structure available within the National Operational Guidance document that people can look to as a template to build a local fire group. Suggested members, I won't go through these individually, but it's really just anybody and everybody that's got an interest in managing that land around about where you are or where your community woodland is, and that list is not exhaustive, but there's a need for just anybody that can help to be on there. I'm just noticing that I've not put Scottish Fire and Rescue Service on there. We should always be part of a fire group, but importantly, we never ever seek to lead the fire group, but we always do want to be part of it. Okay, so what happens if there is a fire and we come along? So first of all, it's important to know what the legislation says, and the Fire Scotland Act 2005 makes it very, very clear as to the responsibility for the fire service at an incident. And essentially, to boil it all the way down, and if the fire service turns up to an incident, we immediately assume overall command of everything and everybody that's involved in that incident, even if we don't know about you. So even if you are somewhere in the vicinity doing something to do with the fire and you get hurt, that's our fault, and we will be held to account for that, which is why sometimes we can be a little bit restrictive and exclude people from incidents, because we are responsible for your safety, and we need to make sure that we're not putting anybody that isn't suitably trained and suitably equipped in harm's way. So to give some reassurance, as I said earlier on, we are the 4th largest in the world and certainly the largest in the UK. We have 357 fire stations made up of a variety of different duty types, which is what all those initials are in the brackets. 50 whole-time fire stations, that's stations that are crewed 24 hours a day by professional firefighters. One which is whole-time and day crewed, which means that one of the appliances overnight doesn't have a crew, but the other one does. 23 which are both whole-time and retained duty systems. So that's where there's one whole-time pump and one pump that is crewed by people who are alerted by pagers who have got a normal employment that just turn out to help us when required. 240 stations, by far the largest number, that are fully retained duty system. So as I said, these are people who work in the community, live in the community, have a pager. They are trained to the same standard as our whole-time colleagues, but they aren't used as regularly, and they tend to be in our more rural areas. But we've also got 43 volunteer stations, so these are absolutely in our most rural locations, and our volunteer firefighters are not trained to the same standard. They don't turn out to the same type of incidents as our other duty systems, but they absolutely do turn out to wildfires, which is important for this conversation. So from those 357 stations, we've got 637 appliances that can come out across the whole country to deal with a wildfire as required. And just to give you a bit of an idea about what that looks like, the red dots are our whole-time crews. So you can see they're predominantly in the central belt and certainly around about our main population centres. The blue dots are where our retained colleagues are around the country, and you can see the spread there is everywhere. And our volunteer stations tend to be in our more remote rural areas, and certainly on the west coast and on our in our highland areas. So of those 637 appliances, all of them can turn out and do turn out to wildfires. However, we do have a specialist. Oh, sorry, I've skipped a few forward there. We do have a specialist cadre of officers that are trained to a different standard for wildfire specifically. So our wildfire response has 4 different tiers within it. Tier 1 is every appliance on every station. Tier 2, we have 21 stations around the country that are trained to a higher standard, have different equipment and PPE available to them, and they are called our wildfire support stations. That's Tier 2. Tier 3 are our wildfire specialists. There are 10 wildfire specialist stations across the country. They're all located based upon the risk that exists around the country. So there's none in the centre of Edinburgh, for example, but they are around about our more rural areas, the bulk of them in the Highlands area. The Tier 3 stations have specific vehicles as well as a normal fire engine, the typical fire engine you can imagine. They've got a 4x4 pickup that tows a trailer with an all-terrain vehicle on the back. They've got fogging units, they've got leaf blowers, they've got brush cutters, and they are also our tactical burn team, so they can do back burning and put in fire breaks using fire as a weapon against fire. That's Tier 3. And Tier 4, we've got 12 trained officers across the country at senior officer level who are actually a UK deployable asset and have been deployed across to Greece in the past, and will be deployed wherever is required in the UK, as long as a minister signs off on that. It's not just a given. But those 12 officers are trained to the very highest level in wildfire suppression tactics, and they provide tactical advice to the incident commander on the best approach to be taken, because incident commanders cannot be specialists in absolutely everything. So for all of our more complex disciplines, we have a tactical advisor who can provide that absolutely up-to-date, best level of information to the incident commanders. But you can see at the bottom of that list there, partnerships and other responders. We absolutely recognise the value that other responders can bring and that partnership can bring, and we understand that there's a huge amount of both knowledge and experience and equipment that exists in the land management sector that we need to be able to tap into to support us at the most serious of wildfires. And we've seen great examples of that in recent history. A couple of large fires we had last year at Cannock and again at Daviet. We saw some excellent work carried out by local gamekeepers, foresters and farmers to support the wildfire response in those areas. So it's really important that we've got a good structure in place that allows our partners to help us. So at a wildfire, and I won't dwell too much on this, I've just got a couple more slides to go before I get to my final piece. The incident command at a wildfire, the thing to remember, enshrined in law, is the incident commander is in overall command of all resources. Every single resource that is there, whether it be fire, police, ambulance, farmer, keeper, you name it, we're in overall command of all of them. It doesn't mean we can deploy all of them, so I would never deploy a police officer, but I can certainly tell the police officer's boss what's going to happen and they will deploy their officers appropriately. We are responsible for everyone's health and safety, whether we know you're there or not. So at wildfires that are extremely large, we want everybody to come who's wanting to help to the instant command point, so we know that you're there. We can identify where you're going to be and what you're going to be doing and make sure that you are not in harm's way. So we will put in place a very formal structure, and I'll give an example of that in just a second. And we will do a very thorough risk assessment and management process. That's something that we instill in our incident commanders from the very first level all the way up to the very top, that risk assessment and risk management is critical. We'll agree priorities with the landowner, and you know, as I said earlier on, life risk will always be our key priority, but we will look and see what other values at risk need to be protected, and we'll decide what tactics are to be used and how we will use our partners to do that. And it will very much be that partnership approach when it comes to that level. We use a protocol that you may have heard of called LACES, which is lookouts, anchor point. The A used to be awareness, but it's been changed just in the last year. So it's lookouts, anchor point, communications, escape routes and safety zone. That's the structure we will use for wildfires. We will have lookouts strategically placed to keep an eye on how the fire is developing and look for any spot fires that are happening. The anchor point is where we'll mount our attack from. We'll make sure there's a good communications strategy in place so that everybody can be kept up to date with what's happening. And importantly, we will have escape routes identified and safety zones where people can either muster safely for pre-deployment or retreat to should the fire change direction. And that will be well communicated across everybody. So just to give a sort of a little pictorial view of what that looks like, and I apologise, this is a little bit small, so I'll just describe, there's actually 3 different incidents on the screen at the moment. So this little bit up here, if you can see, in fact, you know what I'll do? I'll use this. This is an incident with 2 fire engines at it. So we've got one incident commander, they've got somebody supporting them, and then we've got 2 crews dealing with the fire. And we can scale that up to a 4-pump incident. So again, you've got your incident commander with somebody helping them. And then we've just got more crews out and about. And you can see here, we've got our lookout as per the LACES protocol. Again, this is a slightly bigger one, 5 pumps, but this time the incident commander's got more of a support helping them out. And we've got a tactical lookout here, a slightly bigger crew here. You can see how it can scale up quite easily and quite quickly, all the way up to this one, which is 15 pumps, which is probably the sort of size we'd see at a medium-sized wildfire, where we've got the command team now. We've got the person in charge. We've got 1 lookout, 2 lookouts. We've got specialist responders, so that would be our tier 3 responders. And we've got lots and lots of different crews around about in this area here. Now, it may well be that some of your folk are in amongst that, but you'll never be without either a communications link to these folks, the sector commanders, or you may have a firefighter with you who acts as that conduit. You can see with this large incident, we've now got a whole sector devoted to getting water for the incident. And you can see this kind of grey shading where we have support to make sure that the response is effective. And everybody thinks that this is the bit they want to be doing. They want to be out fighting the flames, but actually this bit is the bit that adds real value. The logistics behind how we get this bit to do their job is as important. So if people turn up to support us at an incident and we ask them to do things like ferry people or equipment from point A to point B, or help us get access into a specific location, or help us to identify where water supplies are, sometimes we can get some disgruntled comments afterwards because they wanted to be at the flames, but actually they've had no training, they've not got suitable equipment, and they don't have suitable PPE. So there's no way at all that this person here is going to put people in a situation that is going to cause them harm potentially. But we have equally as important jobs far away from the flames that allow the people that are trained and equipped suitably to do their job properly. So the final slide I want to go up before we have any questions is what we do after every incident. And I do mean every single incident, not just wildfires. Every incident we go to, whether it's one fire engine or 100 fire engines, we will do a debrief. We will identify what learning we can take from it, what went well, what didn't go so well, what challenges we had. We will talk through the rationale behind decision making, and we will make sure that we capture all of that in a very formalised process. So we will debrief specific incidents. So for example, the Cannock wildfire has been debriefed as a specific incident, but we have also done an annual thematic. Every year we do an annual thematic review of all wildfires to see what common threads we've got. We will always do an internal debrief first of all, so that we get our information, and where we've had large incidents with a lot of partners helping us, we will then pull together a multi-agency incident to make sure that we understand how others experienced the incident, what challenges they had that we may have caused, and it's not to explain why that happened, it's to help raise awareness, but also for us to hear back about what other people's perceptions of the incident were, how they felt things could have gone better, and we take the debrief process extremely seriously, so much so that after every debrief we will develop an action plan, and that does get reported back to His Majesty's Chief Inspectors of Fires in Scotland. So it's a very formal process that does ultimately get placed before Parliament and by way of a report at the end of the reporting year. So if you are ever involved in a large wildfire, then be ready for the work that comes afterwards to join the debrief. It's an integral part of. So that's been quite a lot I've covered there. Hopefully that's been of interest. I'll happily take any questions that you might have. Stunned silence, that's always the best way to finish a presentation.
I'd like to know where people can access some kind of written information, Bruce. You mentioned the National Operational Guidance document. Where can people access that? So
it is available online, and what I'll do is I will put a link in the chat bar.
Perfect.
And everybody can get it from that point. If that's okay.
That's brilliant. Ailey, in you come, your hands up.
Hi there. I work for Scottish Forestry and kind of coordinate the network of outdoor and woodland learning groups around Scotland. So we're keen to be, sending a positive message out to our network and reminding them about wildfire risk. I think there's a lot of people out there that still don't realise it is, a high fire risk time of year. But I think my question was, going forward, like we were trying to update people last year on Scottish Fire and Rescue Services wildfire warning messages, and I was just wondering how frequently you update your warnings for like nationally but also in local areas, because I think last year there was maybe a wee bit of a lag in one period, and we were trying to say, we were trying to tie in with yourselves, but we were just waiting to it'd be really handy to know like how frequently that you update the message.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ellie. So just to kind of expand on it a little bit, the every time the fire danger risk goes to very high, the Scottish Wildfire Forum generates a wildfire danger assessment. And it is circulated through a large network of emails by the Scottish Wildfire Forums, well, by our vice chair, actually, Michael Bruce. And the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service turns that into a public-facing, public information piece. So there isn't a regularity with which that's put out. It only gets put out when the fire danger rating gets above very high. And that's been a conscious decision, because if we put out every week or every fortnight, people become blind to it. But if you just put it out when there is a risk, then people know, okay, I've got to do something about it. So we do have our own website, but it's not very good. And it's actually been a topic of conversation at the Wildfire Forum recently, where we're trying to reinvigorate the website, and it will be where all these documents go. It won't be the only place they go. We will continue to put out wildfire danger alerts through the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and via the MailChimp list that is populated by Michael Bruce. So there isn't a regularity, I'm afraid, Daily. It's just as and when the risk gets high. We are looking probably at one next week. The most we've put out in one season is 21. Last year it was relatively quiet. And they tend to be either a 3 or 4 day duration, because that's as far out as we can accurately forecast. So there really are good bits of information, and the ideal situation is where, when we put out a wildfire danger assessment, that triggers action at the ground level. So, for example, I'll just use Colin's Cairngorms National Park Authority. If we put out a warning that says we're going to have very high fire behaviour in and around the Cairngorms National Park, that would trigger signs getting put out to warn the public. But the important thing is that when the fire danger drops, that they get removed, the signs get picked up again, because people become blind to them if they're there all the time. So hopefully that answers your question. It's probably not the ideal situation where it's not a regular thing to look for, but if they do hit your inbox, then it's because the risk is high.
And sorry, just on that, when you're saying about the MailChimp list, do you need to be part of the forum to be part of the list, or do you just add your details to the website that you mentioned?
No, neither of those. You don't have to be a member at all. So we haven't got the facility on the website to receive people's emails, but what we can do is if you send me your email address, I can get you added to the list.
Perfect.
The ideal scenario is that if you're part of an agency, we send that communication to a single point of contact within that agency that then circulates it further within their network.
Okay. I would need to find out who that might be in Scottish Forestry.
I can tell you that's probably Virginia Harden Scott who's on the call.
Who's on the call? Okay, great. Virginia, you can pass that on to me then.
Thank you. And thank you, Bruce. I was going to mention the website and I thought, should I, shouldn't I? So you've done that brilliantly.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bruce. Now we've got Lawrence here as well. Lawrence, in you come.
Hello there. It's very interesting. On a practical level, I'm putting together a fire plan, strangely enough, for my insurer. But I tried to contact the local fire station and found that it was retained, because I thought sort of face-to-face would be a good way to be able to go over ordnance, survey maps, access routes, and so on and so forth. But the retained guys are very elusive. It's actually Huntly, but that falls under Aberdeen. What's the best way to make contact, to make sure that information is shared? Not only our own holdings, but there are other forestry holdings close by. We'd want to do it sort of as a team rather than lots of independent information going to Huntly Fire Station.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 3 different control centres in Scotland. We've split the country into 3 chunks for admin purposes, and the north chunk is the one that Huntly sits within. We have a control centre at Dundee that oversees all of the north, and that's where we collate all of the fire plans that are sent to us. So that would be where I would recommend that you send the fire plan to. The details are available on our website, and again, I can probably put that in the chat bar, which would be useful. But it's Dundee Operations Control will gather all that information. If you're looking for any information or advice on what should be in a fire plan, then we can certainly get help for you. We do have people that can give good quality information. Our wildfire tactical advisors, in fact, are the ones that would be the best place to do that. So I can, if probably the best way to do that, Lawrence, would be if you send me an email and I'll make contact with the person that's closest to you, and they can provide some support to you.
That would be brilliant. As I say, it sort of felt a little bit in the dark. I couldn't even find out where or if there are fire hydrants that you guys would use, which the insurer was sort of thought that was a bit basic to miss that sort of point. But
yeah. And so any fire hydrant, we actually fire hydrants are managed by the fire service, believe it or not. We have an undertaking with Scottish Water, so we'll use water supplies from anywhere. We have a legal exemption for any cost. We can take water from anywhere, including people's koi carp ponds, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, we can take water supplies from anywhere and everywhere.
Okay, that's fine. I'll send an email. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. Anybody else got a question directly for Bruce just now before we pass on to Colin?
I've put the address of our command and control centre in the chat bar there. That's where all fire plans should be sent to for the North Service Delivery area.
Thank you, Bruce. Got one question from Harper. Thank you, Harper.
Hello, I work for Highland Adapts, which is the Highland Region's Climate Resilience Partnership. I was wondering, especially in your work with the Wildfire Forum, is there a way for us to engage to learn from that forum on any perceived future, changes in the landscape due to climate change? Not the physical landscape, I mean like the what you're doing. And yeah, do you work with partners such as ourselves, which are not responders? We're not, responding to things, but we're more thinking about the longer scale picture.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Harper. The forum isn't just made up of responders. We've got a broad church of members, including Trees for Life, Nature Scot, Scottish Forestry, Forest and Land Scotland, Confor, the list goes on. It's really any agency, group or forum that thinks that they have an interest in either getting information out to prevent fires from happening, responding, or just really landscape management, are welcome to come to the forum. There's no cost associated. It's just a quarterly meeting of people who have an interest. So our stated aims are to provide good quality information, education and information in relation to wildfire. And clearly climate change is going to have a bearing on that. So we don't actually have any agency involved that is specifically looking at the impact of climate change, but we are all keenly aware of the changes that are happening. And we are unfortunately beginning to see some exhibited behaviour that would point towards climate change perhaps happening in a more accelerated time frame than we imagined. So you'd be very welcome to come along to the forum, and that can either be on an ongoing basis or on an ad hoc basis, whichever suits. And again, if you want to get in touch with me offline, I can certainly get details out to you.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, Harper. Okay, everybody, thank you very much. Bruce, thank you for that. That was really informative. And if it's okay with you, I will turn your slideshow into PDF and send out to participants on the call just now.
Please do, and I've put my email address in the chat bar should anybody want to get in touch.
Fabulous, thank you very much. Okay, Colin, over to you. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing the slides just so that we can see you, since we've not got slides, so bear with me 1 second whilst I do that.
You get an even bigger image of my face, which is
that's it, and I'm going to put you on spotlight as well, so there you go.
Well, that's punishment for not preparing slides, for which I apologise.
Well,
but good afternoon to you all. I'm going to talk about the planning we're doing around the wildfire issue within the Cairngorms. That was a hard presentation to follow because that was very, very good from Bruce. There will be some overlap, but my presentation is a bit briefer, which is a relief to you all, I'm sure. But As we all know, the issue of wildfire is rising up the agenda, both in Scotland and the wider UK. The Cairngorms National Park Authority have recognised that, and we have an action in our National Park Plan to produce what we're calling an integrated wildfire management plan, and that's something I'm currently working on. Last week we had the passing of the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Bill, which is helpful. Muirburn is an integral part of fire management in the Cairngorms, and we needed to know where it was going to operate in legislation going forward. So we've got that information now. The new Muirburn licensing system is likely to come into force in September of 2025, so not this year. And that's because there is a lot of work still to do before that's up and ready. And most crucially, as part of that, is the issue of how people who are carrying out Muirburn will measure the depths of peat on their land. There's now a 40-centimetre peat depth limit, which will come into law, and deeper than that, you can't burn the vegetation on top of peat, which is deeper than 40 centimetres. So how do you measure that in a landscape where the depth of peat is continually changing, and where it's often seems to be, large chunks of Scotland seem to be somewhere between 30 and 50 centimetres. It's quite a difficult technical issue, and we're still wrestling with that. However, we are now, there is not a lot more clarity about Muirburn, and that puts us in a better place to develop the wildfire plan for the park. So what is an integrated wildfire management plan? So I'm keen to start by saying what it can't be, and it can't be any sort of prescriptive plan for fighting fires in the park. Many of you who've been to wildfires, you will know they can be hugely pressurised events. They put enormous pressure on the individuals that are attempting to lead, on the teams that are attempting to get organised quickly. They can be fast moving, fast expanding, and there's a huge number of variables involved in terms of wind, the amount of fuel, the terrain you're fighting the fire on, its location in terms of how remote it is. It's a very demanding environment, and I've never known a paper-based estate fire plan to stand up to that pressure for more than a few minutes, really, because there are just so many variables involved. So an integrated wildfire management plan is absolutely not going to be a prescriptive document. We see it in 3 broad sections, and these mirror much of what Bruce talked about. So firstly, the main thing in terms of tackling wildfires is to prevent them from starting in the first place. So we want to minimise the risk of fire starting. And we're going to ask every land holding to carry out a form of risk assessment across their land. So to risk assess the land in relation to wildfire. Where are people most likely to interact with flammable fuels? Because we know virtually all fires are started by people. How do visitors use the site? Where are the informal camping sites and picnic locations? So that's the risk assessment. And then how do you apply that risk assessment? Well, that's perhaps where ranger services come in. Land manager patrols, you patrol the most vulnerable areas. It's about the signage that we're going to put up. It's about communication. It's about wider education for the wider public in the countryside. How should they be behaving? Currently, we've got a consultation on a potential bylaw, which will feed into this section of the plan. That consultation is about the management of recreational fires. It's not about Muirburn as such. And it contains 3 options. One is that we don't have a bylaw, but we focus even more intensely on signage and education. A second option is that we have a bylaw where there's no recreational fires allowed in the park at any time. And the third option is that we have a ban on recreational fires and potentially a Muirburn at a time of very high fire risk as defined by the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. That consultation has generated a huge amount of public interest. There's a lot of public concern about this issue. Really going right back to the post-COVID lockdown response of the public, where loads of people, much more than the normal, came into the countryside, often people who weren't used to being in the countryside and who didn't really know how best to behave in that. And there was an awful lot of a huge increase in recreational fires, campfires, picnic fires, etc. as a result of that. Not all of those, or hardly any, developed into wildfires, but there was a considerable amount of community concern about the additional risk. And the bylaw consultation is a response to that community concern. So to date, I think we've had almost 400 responses to the bylaw, to the consultation, which is open until the 17th of April. And those consultation responses go right across the board in terms of the options that we're considering, but it does show the amount of public interest in this issue. So we need to focus a big amount of effort on wildfire prevention, but despite the best efforts, fires will start at some point in time. We will have fires. So a second section of this plan will be about a basic level of preparedness that we want all land holdings to aspire to. And that's about the basic fire plans, which Bruce talked about, which show your access routes, your lock gates, your meeting points, where the water is. It's about equipment and PPE and training for firefighters. It'll include models of collaboration across the states and how the states should communicate about the fire issue. The role of an estate office can be absolutely crucial in a wildfire, and it's often overlooked. And this role has a training requirement, so we're going to have a section about that. It's about the role of fire groups and how formal or informal they should be. There's quite a debate about that in the park at the moment. I was at the South Grampian Fire Group this morning, which is a very well organised unit based on Deeside. But it is the only active fire group in the park at the moment. Others have come and gone over time. It's quite a difficult issue on which to base a group and to keep energy and commitment going over a long period of time, because you may not have a wildfire for 10 years. You may not have a reason to actually be called out and to be organised. So there is a history of fire groups falling into abeyance across the park and across wider Scotland. And land managers now are just in favour of having informal approaches based on WhatsApp groups and that sort of thing, because they're regularly in contact with each other, with their neighbours, over a multitude of issues. So why not just tackle fire planning on the same basis? We would like something a bit more formal than that, just so that we know there is consideration of the issue going on. And we're looking at perhaps using the existing deer management group structures as a basis for a sort of informal fire group type arrangement. So it could be deer management groups meet twice a year. We could have just a short agenda item for every meeting on a certain level of fire preparedness. That's one thing we're looking at. It's increasingly important that with the diversity of land use interest within the wider countryside, that a full range of land management interests are involved in the one group. And that is something I'll come back to towards the end of this presentation. Helicopters is something that Bruce has talked about. I totally agree with him that this plan should focus on the ground response, and that helicopters are not a silver bullet in this context, but they are an issue which land managers bring up a lot. They find it quite vexing. There's issue about who has authority to request helicopter assistance, and then who pays for it. That's the crucial issue. There seems to be a variety of levels of insurance across the park. So some land managers feel they are insured for a fire in any habitat. Other land managers are less sure of that. There's an issue about whether people are insured to fight fires in native woodland. and particularly in the Cairngorms within some of our fantastic Caledonian pinewood remnants. Because these don't have a commercial value, and because they don't have a sort of replanting replacement type cost, they're quite difficult to insure. It's quite difficult for an insurer to come up with a premium and the value that they can be insured for. So we're looking at various options to make sure that everybody is properly insured for the cost of helicopter firefighting right across all our native woodlands, because they're national assets after all. Many estates in the Cairngorms National Park are very well kitted out for fighting fires, and they have staff who are expert in doing so. But many will be less well prepared, and that's particularly the case for many smaller landholdings. So we want to get all landholdings up to a certain level of preparedness. So a third section of the plan is about how we build an acceptable level of wildfire resilience into a changing landscape. So there are a much wider range of legitimate land management objectives in the Highlands than there were, say, 20 years ago. We have to recognise that and respect that and work with all land managers. So many land managers want to increase woodland, as you do yourselves. They want to increase scrub cover. They want to increase structural diversity of vegetation. And this obviously has benefits for some aspects of biodiversity, and it increases carbon sequestration, which is obviously a key part of government policy at the moment. Plant growth and carbon sequestration are one and the same thing after all. However, this does create wildfire issues. Increased structural diversity in vegetation does lead to increased fuel loads for wildfires. And that means fires can burn more intensely and they're much harder to put out. So land managers are essentially making a trade-off between the benefits of increased vegetation with the risk of more intense wildfires. We know from experience abroad and increasingly from experience in this country that wildfires in an environment where fuel loads are high can easily get beyond the capacity of firefighters on the ground to tackle them effectively. So we need to find some way of breaking up areas of continuous high fuel load. So this section of the plan will discuss issues like what constitutes a fire break, how do we create them, how do we manage them, are people willing to create them? And some landholdings they're not, so we need discussions around that. If you have fire breaks, what frequency should they be in the landscape to be useful? And no one's got all the answers to these questions, and we need to involve all our land managers in a respectful debate about that. And we need discussions across the park, and need to look at the issue quite strategically. But resilience is also about people. The Cairngorms has a fantastic resource in terms of skilled people and kit who can fight fires. With Muirburn becoming, well, a certain number of estates are no longer conduct Muirburn. There's an issue about how we retain and enhance those Muirburn skills, because there's no doubt about it that people who practice Muirburn do have a skill set which is highly useful when it comes to fighting wildfires. They practice with their kit regularly. You know it's going to be maintained and serviced. Fire to them is much more familiar. It's not such a big, scary thing as your first wildfire is inevitably going to be. You know when to tackle a fire. If it goes down the back of a hill, that's the time to hit it. If it's raging up a hill in high heather, that's perhaps the time to stand back and let it hit a feature which will slow it down before you attack again, conserve your energy. So they've got all that skills and knowledge, and we do need to retain that and find ways to maintain the investment in both skills and equipment at a time when Muirburn is becoming less of a regular management practice across many estates. We probably need to do a fourth section of this plan, which is to look at individual communities and kind of risk assess those communities in relation to wildfire. So when I say communities, I really mean settlements. across the park, we have quite a few settlements which are right in amongst the forest, right in amongst high fuel loads. I'm thinking of areas like Nethy Bridge, like Colin Bridge, and lots of scattered housing, which are quite now vulnerable to wildfire, or they could be in particularly severe conditions. So I think we need to do some sort of risk assessment around those communities, because there's a high level of concern from people who live there. And there's an education issue there, because many people have perhaps an overdeveloped fear of wildfire at the moment, because what they see on the news from Hawaii and Australia and all that sort of thing, and maybe have a lack of understanding of what typical fire behaviour is in this country. So Bruce talked about crown fires being a very rare thing, and that's thankfully the case, but that's not the perception that many people have in settlements that are embedded in forests. They think that's what every forest fire looks like, and that's the risk to their houses. So we do need some education around that. At the moment, I'm concentrating in discussions with those landowners who have the highest fuel loads, because this plan is most challenging to them. For many people who are maintaining low fuel loads because of high grazing pressure or because of muir burn, the whole issue of wildfire is something that they're less concerned about, because they feel they are on top of it and they have reduced the risk. So I've focused most of attention on those land managers who are perhaps managing to have high fuel loads and who are not doing muir burn and who have reduced grazing pressures. And going to them and seeing what mitigation measures would you consider, asking them to identify what are the assets that need protecting, and they can be people-based assets, they can be buildings, but they can also be natural assets. They can be particularly important areas of forest, for example, and how might we protect those in the event of wildfire. And that can be quite a challenging conversation, because people are perhaps coming from a context where they feel wildfire management may conflict with conservation objectives. So there are some discussions to be had around that, and there's also crucial discussions about how they're going to maintain skills and equipment. But the politics of all this is creating probably the biggest set of problems, certainly on a strategic level. So the muir burn bill consultation has undoubtedly caused a lot of rancour, and a lot of the people who carry out muir burn feel that their interests have been damaged. And the whole culture of mutual aid, which has been very strong across the Highlands for a long number of years, is threatening to break down. So we have people saying that they will not attend fires if they occur on certain other properties, and a more strategic response coming through in the sense that people are saying they will not attend fires on those properties which have not done something to mitigate against a wildfire itself, who have not put in fire breaks, who have not invested in skills and equipment. And if that culture of mutual aid breaks down, it becomes quite a dangerous situation, I think, for the country as a whole. Bruce will confirm that SFRS get an enormous amount of support from people from land managers in general at certain wildfires, and they would struggle, I think, in a situation where it was very dry across Scotland and there were multiple wildfires. I think they would struggle to work effectively without broad-scale land management support. So it's more than slightly concerning. It's very concerning that this political issues have developed to the extent that they have. It's something we need to tackle. I don't have all the answers for that. Hopefully time will reduce some of the anger that's currently being felt. But yeah, we're not in the best place to develop this integrated wildfire management plan in terms of the politics and the way people are feeling about it. So that's something you might want to discuss. That's the key things I was going to run through. And I'm very happy to take questions from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. That was really informative and very current, so thanks very much for that. Any questions? Virginia's put a comment actually in the chat saying just to highlight existing guidance for forestry and wildfire and the Scottish Wildfire information not accessible. So two links that she's put in there for the practice guide and a link to Scottish Forestry's wildfire prevention. Thanks for doing that, Virginia. Any questions for Colin? Colin, I've got one. Where will people be able to find a template? Because I think it would be useful for CWA to have a template of a fire management plan that we could share with our member groups if they were looking to create their own plan.
So at the moment, I'm collating good examples of estate wildlife wildfire plans around the park, and there are quite a number of those, and I will have one of those in the integrated wildfire management plan when it's complete. But if there was a particular need at the moment, we could probably, with permission of certain estates, we could probably circulate some good examples if people wanted that.
That would be really helpful. I think that would be useful for our members.
And I'm also sure Bruce might well have something up his sleeve on that front.
Yeah, so we have a template that we can offer as well, but it tends to be more focused on what we would need when we turn up rather than how the estate would use it. So it may not be entirely appropriate, but there is a project that's just being initiated by Forest and Land Scotland to develop a consistent mapping template. So just now the different icons on maps can lead to confusion, and whilst there are a number of different sources of icons that can be used, there's no preferred option. So Forest and Land Scotland are going to lead a project with the Wildfire Forum, a number of its members, to get a consistent approach across all of Scotland that can be put onto all these different fire plans. So that there's a number of different strands of work coming together. But I'm actually, no pressure Colin, but I'm actually sitting waiting on Colin to develop his integrated fire plan, because it will be the exemplar for Scotland, and I'm really interested and excited to see what it looks like when it's finished, because Colin and his team are the first ones that have grasped the nettle and actually gotten on and done it. So I'm looking forward to see how it all pans out.
You heard it here live, folks.
Colin and his team. I'm quite intrigued with this Colin and his team reference, because I haven't found them yet. But
that's what you call your dog, isn't it?
Fabulous. Well, that would be brilliant if when all that comes to fruition, if we could possibly link up and get some templates that we can share with our members, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Now somebody's got their hand up. Let's see who that is. Andrew, in you come.
Hi, I'm Andy Robertson from the Anagach Woods Trust. How do we contact you best, Colin, to discuss issues that might be relevant for Anagach?
Just through the Park Authority. I can circulate an email address through Sharon, I'm sure. No problem at all. That'd be good to chat about, Anagach, yes.
Are you okay if I put your email in the chat, Colin?
Surely, yeah.
Or maybe
surely.
it'd be easier if you can do it yourself and need to seek it out. Are you able to type that in just now?
Yeah.
That'd be wonderful. Any other questions? The real practicalities about creating the plan. Pierce, in you come.
Yeah, it's just to say that I will be trying to work up a Community Woodlands Association information sheet about wildfire risk and management. So we'll include some examples of risk assessments and what to include in a wildfire plan. And I hope I can be working with Colin on that.
Thank you, Pierce. Maybe we should have spoken before I said, wouldn't it be good if we could have a template? That'd be super, brilliant. Okay, any other questions before we finish up? Okay, so folks, I'm going to just put into the chat just now a link to our feedback form. It's always good for CW to get feedback that we can share with our presenters, share your thanks for them giving up their time to inform you of the content of the presentation, but it also helps us to identify any gaps in what we do that we could support our members. So if you have time, I'd be very grateful if you could click on the link and fill in the very brief feedback form, and I'll also email that out to you next week. So Colin and Bruce, thank you very much indeed for a really informative session this afternoon. I've certainly learned loads and probably have lots of questions. I'm sure you all will. Our recording will eventually go onto YouTube. It'll be maybe 10 days before that happens. My colleague who does all that kind of side of things is on leave. So when Jen is back, we will have that in our YouTube channel. And you'll be able to review that then as well. So any other questions, please do come back to us and we will signpost you to the right people who can answer. So again, my thanks to everybody, my thanks to you all for coming along, and I wish you all a very lovely long weekend if you so happen to have the holiday. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very
Cheers.
much. Bye.
Thank you very much.